we'll start with maybe a 5-minute breathing meditation. So we'll start with remembering what we learned about the posture, trying to settle the body in a stable, comfortable, upright position. So we think mainly about the back, keeping the back upright, trying to avoid slouching or leaning, but also letting go of rigidity or tension in the body, trying to let the body fall into place. And keep the hands in the lap right over left with the palms upturned and the thumbs gently touching or resting our hands on our knees. Our eyes are gently closed or slightly open, letting in enough light to remain alert. And we begin to let go of attending to the environment, having a sense of withdrawing our awareness, holding it to the body and mind, letting go too of thoughts of the past and plans for the future, concentrating our awareness in the present moment by attending closely to the physical sensation of the air moving into and back out of the tip of the nostrils. Noticing quickly when anything other than that one physical sensation arises in the mind, and without judgment or frustration, lifting our awareness up from that distraction and placing it gently but firmly again and again on the breath. You may find it helpful to silently count each exhalation, going up to 5, and then starting again with 1. If that seems distracting, then just try to hold the mind to the sensation of the air on both the in-breath and the out-breath, in the space around the nostrils. And then with the mind feeling calm and concentrated, establish a broad altruistic motivation for your time, wanting to use your time to find some tools, some techniques to establish and deepen new constructive ways of thinking and acting, and to find ways of diminishing tendencies and habits that are not constructive, wanting to change the mind in order to be of greater benefit, not only to have more peace of mind, more inner contentment, but to be of greater benefit to those around you. So try to set that kind of broad, altruistic motivation. All right. So we will move into class 2. I did misspeak last week. It's normally a 4-week course. It's meant to be, but we have a retreat next weekend, starting on Friday night. So can't have class on Friday night because of the first session of the retreat, the public, where it's a public talk, but it's on the same topic as the retreat. So most welcome to come. Venerable Rabina is traveling here to do that retreat. So that's so it'll be a 3. We'll have three sessions instead of 4. On the YouTube channel, there's a number of uh, complete versions of this that have been recorded. So there's ways of finding anything that we may not be able to cover. Uh, all right. So the retreat begins Friday night, and it's from 7 to 8:30 on Friday, and then it's 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Saturday and Sunday, with a 2-hour lunch break each day. So it's 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, and then a lunch break, so that people can leave and go to a restaurant if they want to, or they could go back home if they want to, and come back. And so it's kind of a longer break. Uh, no, it's going to be mainly a teaching retreat, I would say, Venerable Rabina style. We're not actually calling it. I just tend to call things like that a retreat, because they're longer periods of time. But we're not actually calling it a retreat. We're calling it a weekend intensive, on the website. Retreats in Tibetan Buddhism, you have meditation retreats, but you also have teaching retreats. And this is more like a teaching retreat. Venerable doesn't. She does some meditations, and it could be that there will be some, but it tends to be more teaching and question and answer. It tends to be more so her style. So we will start by talking a little bit, because this course, it's a course meant for people who have no background in Buddhism or Buddhist meditation, but it is still coming from Tibetan Buddhism. It's still steeped in that particular approach. So wanted to talk a little bit about how meditation historically fits with uh, Buddhism, and again Tibetan Buddhism. So, from this one perspective, we defined meditation, um, in a way, in 2 ways last week. One way of defining it is to say that it is to familiarize the mind with a virtuous object. Another way of defining it is to define it in terms of the gradual perfection of the ability to concentrate the mind on a chosen object. Um, and of course, that chosen object would be virtuous in nature. But the perfection of that is the important part of that, because Buddhism, we talked last week about the idea of calm abiding, and then we talked a little bit about the absorptions um, of the form and formless realms that go past calm abiding. But with calm abiding, as we said, a person, and which is, I mean, important to point out that that's something that, Western science would say doesn't exist. The ability to concentrate the mind on a chosen object for as long as a person would like, without any change in the intensity or the vibrancy of that object appearing to the mind. If you were to ask a neuroscientist or you know, a psychologist or any expert, they would say that concentration, is something that we can only sustain for brief periods of time without the mind moving to some other object, without there being some, and that's true unless a person spends decades of their lives, hours a day, cultivating focused attention, which very few people do. And then when they accomplish calm abiding, they don't talk about it. They won't tell anyone that they have calm abiding, because the Buddha prohibited. Anyone can develop calm abiding. I would imagine there are many Christian monks and Hindu mystics and Jewish mystics, and because every religious tradition has offshoots that are contemplative in nature. Um, and any of so I'm confident that throughout history, all of those different meditators in all of the major religious traditions have achieved calm abiding. They didn't necessarily know what it was. They didn't have the same terminology that Tibetan Buddhism has, but um, you know, it's still not something that has penetrated into, if you were to ask an Indian or they would say, of course, that is something, because that's permeated that culture, but it really hasn't permeated Western culture. So, because there's comparatively so few people doing it, I think. Um, so those are the ways that we can understand what meditation is, but why does a person want to meditate is a different question, and it has a different purpose from the historical Tibetan Buddhist perspective. And from that perspective, its goal is to kind of be the inner technology that a person uses to achieve enlightenment, to fully awaken to their potential, the potential of their mind. So, calm abiding is a critically important tool that we may or may not develop, in this lifetime, um, to aid that process. Buddhism would assert that we can't actually achieve full enlightenment without having developed calm abiding. We can have transformative meditative experiences without calm abiding, but full enlightenment, or even lower nirvana. I don't know if we talked about that kind of comes up more so in Buddhism in a nutshell, but maybe we touched on it last week. So there's Mahayana Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism is predominant in the northern Asian countries. Theravada Buddhism is predominant in the southern Asian countries, and they differ in their stated goal of practice. The vehicle that they um, propound, both taught by the Buddha, both vehicles taught by the Buddha, but having taken hold culturally in different ways. Um, so, lower nirvana is the cessation. So, I mean, again, a lot of this is coming in Buddhism in a nutshell, um, with this class being more so focused on meditation. But in the Theravada tradition, the goal is for oneself to transcend the cycle of rebirth that ordinary sentient beings find themselves in. The mind, and we'll talk, so we'll get into that maybe a little bit later in today's class when we talk about the mind, and because we're going to zoom out a little bit and talk about the nature of the mind. Um, but so the goal of Theravada practice is to put an end to uncontrolled rebirth and to achieve nirvana, which is a state separate from the kinds of experiences that mind and body have when mind and body are under the influence of afflicted states of mind, like hatred and jealousy and ill will and so on. It's possible to train the mind such that body and mind separate at death, but then mind does not take another ordinary form. Mind abides separately from that process, and mind continues, but mind continues just as mind, separate from ordinary form. And that existence is preferable to what we are experiencing, because what we are experiencing comes with a lot of drawbacks. There's a lot of unpleasantness that's part of our experience. And the experience that we are having is one of the better kinds of experiences that are possible, and yet lots of disadvantages to that. So mind abiding as mind, free from hatred and jealousy and maliciousness, and kind of just absorbed in a meditative concentration, is a better type of existence, more pleasant, more enjoyable, more peaceful, more joyous. And that's the stated goal of Theravada practice. Mahayana practice, the stated goal is full enlightenment or Buddhahood rather than lower nirvana. And mind still separates at death. For a Mahayana practitioner who's achieved full enlightenment, mind separates at death and again does not take ordinary form. But what distinguishes lower nirvanas, the kind of experience that mind experiencing nirvana or mind experiencing Buddhahood, it differs in that the Buddha mind can re-enter cyclic existence. That's another way of talking about um, what ordinary minds are experiencing, just rebirth after rebirth after rebirth, going from the best kinds of experiences to the worst kinds, and then just kind of cycling through the various options within ordinary existence. Buddha mind can intentionally re-enter the places where those sentient beings are existing in order to try to help, in order to teach, in order to guide, in order to, because they are enlightened, and enlightenment comes with omniscience, it comes with clairvoyance. There are capacities of mind that are unlocked at that time that a person can bring to bear to be of benefit to others. If you know the minds of others directly, and you know everything else due to omniscience, if you're, because there's no um, consciousness, as we described it, is that which is clear and knowing. It's a formless energy that knows as its nature. And when it's free of the obscurations that limit its capacity, which is what we're experiencing, when it's free of that, it can know all phenomena simultaneously. There's no limit to the mind. The limit comes from the obscurations, the afflictions that are presently characterizing our experience, but they don't characterize the experience of a fully enlightened being. Um, so a fully enlightened being is able to come back under their own power into the places where there are ordinary sentient beings to help. Um, and a mind experiencing nirvana, although it is comparatively a much better experience for that particular mind, there are still what are called the subtle obscurations to omniscience that don't prevent the arising of the nirvanic experience, but they do act as a bar to full enlightenment. That practitioner has not removed those really subtle obscurations to omniscience, whereas fully enlightened practitioner has eliminated even those subtlest stains, those subtlest, the sort of the imprints of the afflictions. And so, from the Mahayana perspective, it's better to be able to re-enter ordinary existence to work for the benefit of ordinary sentient beings rather than just being sort of isolated and separated from ordinary cyclic existence and not being able to use that whole eternity of experience in a way that's not of any that that's not useful for other sentient beings, because you will have an eternity of mind experiencing, but the question is, can you use that actively to help, or are you just sort of separated and isolated from being able? Yeah.
Is there a, this is too long an answer, feel free not to answer, but is there a cultural rationale, historical cultural rationale for why they kind of lowered their standards, if you will, or why that change in goal?
Yeah. So, I mean, so the Buddha taught, so there's different ways of thinking about it, and there's not, as you might imagine, there isn't like global cultural agreement on, because they, if you're a Theravada practitioner, it's kind of uncomfortable, to, so there's different ways of interpreting, because humans are really good at looking at things and interpreting it in different ways, and um, so there's a couple different ways of thinking about it. Both vehicles, because Mahayana and Theravada, it's also, it can also be called Hinayana, which isn't used. It's fallen out of favor as a phrase because it means lesser vehicle. Mahayana means greater vehicle. Hinayana means lesser vehicle. So His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, uses individual vehicle rather than lesser vehicle. He prefers that terminology. Theravada means lineage of the elders, which sounds much better. So that's Theravada is what is generally used, because Hinayana has a little bit of a disparaging quality to it. But the word yana in English means vehicle. So these two vehicles were both taught by the Buddha, really because for some practitioners, the idea of just achieving individual liberation is kind of more manageable. It's something they can kind of wrap their heads around, and then that's still like they did something, like they're still benefited, they're not suffering anymore, and that's great. From the Mahayana perspective, you can't really say persons, but minds experiencing nirvana are reachable by enlightened mind, fully enlightened beings can still reach those sentient, though they're not sentient, because sentient means that the person has delusion, operating in their mind. But from the Mahayana perspective, an enlightened being can still try to convince beings experiencing nirvana to go further and to actually achieve full enlightenment. So, from the Mahayana perspective, it's not like they are truly like lost in a totally separate realm forever. They can still be kind of reached by enlightened mind. Um, the Theravadan perspective, they will generally tell you that full enlightenment is so incredibly difficult that a very incredibly small number of beings really have the ability to do it, and so it's just not um, kind of worth talking about. It's just sort of not. It's so impractical that it's just kind of not worth taking as a sort of cultural goal. And then there's this sort of a difference of opinion about what happens. The often in the Theravada tradition, they will frame the idea of nirvana as the extinction of the mind, the kind of the blowing out of the candle of the mind. Um, and the Mahayana perspective or lineage will disagree with that, and they will say that that there's no force that opposes mind, that mind by definition must continue, and it's just a question of how it continues. So they would say that there are no enlightened beings because whatever you achieve, if you once you achieve nirvana, your mind is gone. Your mind just doesn't exist. So literally, they're seeking non-existence. They're seeking from their perspective. So there's different ways of thinking about it, but the Mahayana perspective completely disagrees with that and says that um, nirvanic beings are existing and experiencing nirvana. Enlightened beings are existing and experiencing full enlightenment. Because there's just so many thousands of sutras that the Buddha taught. The Buddha wasn't really concerned with trying to present only one unified view to every single person that he spoke to. He would try to benefit the person who was in front of him. And that led to a real diversity of sutra material. So that left things up to interpretation kind of later on. So because you can't really, if if you're incredibly advanced, you can't speak to everyone from a perspective of here's the most subtle, most difficult, most comprehensive, because not everyone's prepared to hear that. So when it's kind of like if you were to record everything that Neil deGrasse Tyson says every time he speaks to someone, sometimes he's speaking to kindergartners, sometimes he's speaking to PhD students, sometimes he's speaking to people that are smarter. From the Buddhist perspective, no one is better than the Buddha, but the Buddha is like the very top. So, if you were to like record everything that he ever said, you'd be like, well, this doesn't make any sense because sometimes he said that atoms are like this and they have a shape and they have a color, and other times he's like there's just waves and like you couldn't really reconcile it. Um, but he was kind of lying to the kindergartners because they couldn't handle the truth. Um, so that's yeah. So from the Buddhist perspective, meditation is the method that is employed to engage in this process of becoming fully enlightened. Um, Mainly through, as we talked about last week, um, using stabilizing meditation to develop calm abiding, and then trying to replicate the insights that the Buddha had by engaging in analytical meditation, trying to overcome the afflictions, the delusions, by using single pointed concentration to replicate the insights that the Buddha had, because those insights are the only thing that distinguish an ordinary sentient being from an enlightened being. The Buddha was an ordinary sentient being. He developed his mind. He realized certain truths. He had certain specific, deep, meditative insights, and that unlocked the potential of his mind. And then he abided as a fully enlightened mind rather than an ordinary mind. And we go into, like I said, more detail about that in Buddhism in a nutshell. And okay. So again, to reiterate, the mind is a non-physical energy whose nature is to develop some sort of internal representation, although generally a mistaken representation of whatever it's put upon. Um, and then, of course, Buddhism would agree that the body and the mind are intimately related, intimately connected, but that the brain doesn't give rise to the mind. The mind existed before the coming together of the physical form in the womb. It became associated with that form. Um, and what Buddhism would say is that if you damage the body, then you may damage the ways in which mind can be expressed through that physical form, but you haven't damaged mind itself. You've just prevented mind. Certainly, mind relies upon the physical form for its ability to express itself. But the damaging of the body in whatever ways only prevents that expression through that physical form. It's not actually getting at anything related to the mind itself. Uh, yeah.
What gave rise to mind initially before it was body?
Yeah, Buddhism says that when people asked the Buddha that question, he simply said that when enlightened mind looks at the evolution of existence or the evolution of reality, there is no findable first moment of mind. Um, and that's all that he said about it. He said that he can look back, and he can look back for as long as he wants to try to keep looking back, and all that there is just evolution, is just the movement of mind through form. um, and that Buddhism doesn't, which I think is actually, you know it's not a neat and tidy, kind of origin story, but I think that makes some sense. That it, you know that
You
it,
don't need a tidy origin story. You
yeah,
can get it happened before that.
yeah, no. So it's because,
Yeah.
yeah.
You said about
So from the Buddhist perspective, the question is, how do we want a mind that is beginningless and endless? What kinds of experiences do we want it to have? We can't change the fact that the mind is a beginningless and endless continuity of mental moments. All we can do is change what kinds of experiences that mind is going to be having. And the options are mind can remain ordinary, mind like our mind. It can remain under the influence of what Buddhism would say is delusion and karma, or we can free the mind from the influence of delusion and karma. And then the question is mind going to be experiencing nirvana, or is it going to be experiencing full enlightenment? And those are the only three choices that we have. If we do nothing, then we'll just continue to perpetuate ordinary existence. We'll die, mind and body will separate, mind will take another form, that form will have a lifetime, that form will die, and then so on and so forth. And those are the only three. And it's all just, Buddhism would say that there's no creator that set things up in that way or thought that was a good idea or thought that was reasonable or made sense. It's just nature. It's just the way that things are. It's just there is only nature, and nature permits the experience of nirvana. Nature permits the experience of enlightenment, and nature also permits us to not develop the mind in either of those directions, and just to get more of what's currently going on. Um, so So again, this idea, it's also true that Buddhism describes this. So I said that mind is a beginningless and endless continuity, and I said of mental moments. So that's also kind of an important aspect of the mind that, in a way, explains the role that meditation plays, because the great masters have said or are saying to us that it's kind of like how a movie is comprised of still frames that are just moving at a fast speed, and it seems like it's one continuous thing, but actually it's discrete frames. um, Buddhism says that that's true of the mind. That they describe that in a finger snap, there are 65 moments of mind in a finger snap, which means that there are meditators who who have such deep awareness of how their mind actually functions that they can count them, that they can, um, it's meant to be literally a true statement, that they can observe 65 discrete, definable mental experiences in, an eighth of the second or whatever that might be. And so what Buddhism would say is that each moment of mind influences the next moment of mind, like a chain of dominoes, like, that each moment is giving rise to the next moment. And we can see how that's true in the sense that, when we're um, deeply satisfied or happy or angry or sad, um, that's an intense experience that starts to color all of the remaining. And then it changes. It's not like if we're deeply sad for an hour, that doesn't mean that next week we're still deeply sad, but like the rest of that day was influenced by that hour of deep sadness, and the next day there's still some influence. And Buddhism would say, even 50 years later, the fact that you were deeply sad for an hour on that Tuesday, that there's that there's something still left from that that it colors everything that comes after it. um, and so, if that hadn't happened, um, maybe you would have made a different choice that day. Maybe you would have gone out instead of stayed in. Maybe you would have called someone instead of not calling them. Um, so, there's a chain of causal events that flow from each moment of mind. So, with meditation, concentrating the mind on virtuous objects, the goal is to have a concentrated period of time where we're trying to give ourselves really constructive mental moments. We're trying to focus the mind on love, on compassion, on generosity, on patience, on ethics, for that 20 minutes, with the understanding that when that 20 minutes is up, it leaves imprints in the mind. It has a certain momentum in the mind that's going to hold the mind in a particular direction. And if we repeat that 2, 3, 4 times a day, if we can, maybe twice a day, maybe on the weekends, 3 times a day. Um, and then if we can recollect, you know, things that we, things that we've heard at other times, maybe we're not actively meditating, but we reflect on, that it influences everything that's happening in the day. And our lives are just a whole bunch of those mental moments. So if we can have thousands and thousands and thousands of really constructive mental moments out of the however many hundreds of thousands or couple million mental moments, that there are in a lifetime, then we've moved the mind in a really positive direction that influences the time of death, influences what happens during the time of death, what kind of rebirth the mind will take. Yeah. So that's kind of the theory of that it has a lasting. Of course, there's repetition that's quite necessary. We can't just have one session of meditation and think that that imprint is particularly strong. We need to repeat that couple times a day, every single day, for as many years as we possibly can. But ultimately, that will change the overall trajectory of our mind, in a positive direction. And of course, we can see that the alternative is also true. That um, when people spiral in a negative direction, something bad happens, they lose their job, or someone dies, or someone gets attacked, or and they let their mind kind of spiral in a really negative direction, then there could be months or years or a decade of their life where that just sort of takes over, and it becomes this obsessive kind of negative, um, and that's sort of the opposite of that sort of wrong meditation, because they're familiarizing their mind with really negative ways of thinking, and it has a profound impact on their daily life.
Um, those negative meditations, if it's just thought patterns right now, actual meditation. Um, what's the antidote to that? What would you say it's meditation? Is there a specific, virtuous object that's recommended for people spiraling in that way?
So there's many different antidotes that are presented. So I mean, it really depends on specifically what the wrong thought process is. What if a person's dealing with jealousy, then you would do something different than if you're dealing with hatred. Um, to deal with jealousy, jealousy is a mind that, so a person might feel, like nothing's ever enough, and might, he has kind of a real need, a real kind of hunger for approval and for, feeling, because he never doesn't feel complete in himself, and he needs validation, and that's a real. So to always feel like other people have more than you, and that can really spiral in deep ways. But a different person might be a real short-tempered person, and they might lash out constantly when they're slighted in various ways. So for an angry person, they would need to practice patience. They would need to practice um, non-retaliation, to think about the kindness of others, to think about the disadvantages of anger, the advantages of practicing patience, and then in very small ways, they would work with the least challenging situations that trigger their anger, and then they would try to actively restrain their anger and actively think more constructive, compassionate, loving thoughts toward that person. Whereas if a person's jealous, then it's more so rejoicing at other people's good fortune, because the jealous mind, when they see the good fortune of others, they go immediately to, why not me? Why is it that person, and it isn't me? Whereas the mind of rejoicing thinks, oh, how amazing that they get to experience that car, or that they won the lottery, or that um, so there's conventional antidotes that are kind of the direct opposite of the negative state that's arising. And then there's a deeper antidote that which is called the wisdom realizing emptiness. Um, and that serves as sort of the universal antidote, which is getting at the difference between how things appear versus how they exist. It gets at the solidity and the concretization that happens when we observe, when we perceive, um, and it works with softening how solid and how real kind of our ascent to the world of appearance is. And that is said to undercut all of the delusions in the most profound way. So that's ultimately, that particular insight is actually the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice, because it's like chopping down the tree of the delusions rather than pruning the anger branch and the jealousy branch and the covetous, but we need to do that too. We have to, when anger is arising in the mind, we still in the moment, we apply a conventional antidote, and then simultaneously we're kind of working with how solid and concrete things appear to the mind, and trying to reduce that and soften that, so that we don't get so caught up in the world of appearances. So there's
Is there for this grief in terms of somebody who dies and just the loss of like a partner? Is that are those both considered grief, and then there's specific object that gets focused on as the antidote to those?
so I would say, I mean, of course, with all of the Buddhism doesn't label grief as a specific, like, afflicted state of mind. It can certainly get, a person can perseverate on, a person can, not be able to move past it, and that might be an obstacle. But Buddhism wouldn't define grief as a maladaptive response to loss or anything like that. Whereas Buddhism would say that, like, wishing to harm someone who's harmed you, that's a problem. Like that's different than if someone harms you, it's not a problem to say, hey, like that's not okay, I need you to respect my boundaries. But if you punch them back, like that's the problem that Buddhism would say, like that's a maladaptive response. um so it's not, yeah. So Buddhism would say if you had a partner or a child or a parent or a dog, or and then that sentient being is gone, then of course it's natural that you miss them, that you um it it's also, I think, true that when a person um trains their mind over time, then they recognize that they become capable of recognizing that um, the way that they were relating to that person, or that was kind of through the lens of, this is someone that benefits me, that sees things the way that I see them, that like agrees with me often, um, and is kind, in overt, well, like they say pleasing things, they try to avoid saying unpleasing things, and so they're comfortable to be around. um, I enjoy their company more than people who aren't like that. And so the absence of that is painful because of our habituation to being in comfortable, pleasant situations that are soothing, that are where we feel like we have needs that are being met. Um, Whereas there's kind of no difference between the death of that person and the death of our neighbor, the stranger that we don't, in the sense that they're both sentient beings. um, they're both, you know yeah, they both had loved ones, they both had aspirations, dreams, fears. And now their mind has separated and their mind is going somewhere else. And also that everything that we kind of thought about them, not only was it through the lens of kind of what we like and what we don't like, but also we were concretizing their personality as being, more real than it is, because they had a lifetime before that lifetime, they're going to have a lifetime now. It's the same mind, but we kind of, and even in that lifetime, like they used to be two, they used to be eight, and they were very different. Like when we weren't friends with them when they were five, we were friends with them when they were 30 or 40, or and that's who we think they are. So I do think that the process of training the mind helps with being able to deal with loss, in those ways. But feeling a sense of sadness, feeling a sense of, there's nothing about that Buddhism would say. I mean, Buddhism would say that it is a uh, it isn't something that an enlightened being experiences, but everything that we experience is something that an enlightened being doesn't experience. Um, so it's a side effect of being ordinary, but it's not harmful, unless a person is so overcome with it that they just like can't get out of bed, they can't function. But of course, even if that's true, it's still fine if that's true for like a week or a month. If it's like 5 years or 10 years, then they need some therapy or something, like, then there's something. But Buddhism would say that that's because of attachment to. Buddhism distinguishes between love and attachment. Um, and love is the wish for that sentient being to be happy and to be free of, to be happy and to have the causes of happiness. And then also compassion would be for the wish for them to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. And we're meant to really try to relate to sentient beings through love and compassion rather than this person pleases me and therefore I want to be in contact with them because I'm getting pleased, I'm getting my needs met. And now my needs aren't being met because they're no longer able to do that. Um, but, it's like anything, we are where we are with that today. And so our responses are going to be determined by where we are with that. And then in 10 years and 20 years, we'll be somewhere else with that. And our responses will be different because we've now trained the mind, and now everything is just different than it was before. Um, okay, so let's do another kind of meditative exercise. Um, this is called the 9 round breathing meditation. Um, so it requires a bit of explanation that's helpful before. So it has both a physical component and a visualization component. It's often used, it's called a meditation, but it's kind of more like an exercise. Because if we're doing it because we want to make the mind more serviceable for meditation, then it becomes a virtuous action. If we're doing it because we just want to be like calmer, then it's kind of neutral. So, in and of itself, it's not a virtuous object. But its purpose is to kind of clear stale kind of energy that's in our system, to kind of help the mind meditate more easily, to be able to enter meditation more quickly, to have deeper meditation. So it's kind of a tool that we might use for that purpose. So um, it's called 9 round because there's 3 sections to it. Um, and they're each comprised of 3 breaths. So 9 breaths makes up one cycle of this practice. So I mentioned stale energy and that sort of thing. So the visualization part of this has to do with what are called the central channel and then the left and the right channels. And these are this meditation comes from the Vajrayana tradition or the tantric tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which is where you find the wisdom, particularly about the energetic system of the body, the subtle energy body, the energy system that is. So you can't cut the body open and be like, oh yeah, there's the central channel in there, because these are just energetic kind of like um, high sort of highways through which energy is flowing, but it's not discernible or findable. And it could also be, it could also be helpful ways, because they talk about in Buddhism, they talk about when you concentrate, when you have good concentration and you place that concentration in the body, then the energy kind of coalesces due to the force of your concentration. So it could also be that this is just sort of a helpful guide or a helpful, that visualizing in this way has helpful or beneficial effects. And it isn't necessarily that things actually are like this, but when you concentrate the mind like this, there are useful side effects of doing that. Could be like that is possible. So, but the visualization is that you visualize the central channel, which begins between the eyebrows. So it's essentially the third eye, you could say, um, begins inside the skull, between the eyebrows. You visualize a tube, a hollow, thin, luminous tube of light that they say is about the size of one's pinky, roughly. So it begins here and it goes up, kind of like they say, sort of like an umbrella handle, because it goes up and then it curves to the top of the back of the head, and then it goes straight down in front of the spine, just slightly in front of the spine, and then it terminates at a point 4 finger widths below the navel, inside the body, in front of the spine. So you just kind of generally think about it like that. So it goes up and then so it kind of has this sort of curve, and then straight down. And so it's sort of just inside the skull, but just following like a straight line up to the top of the back of the head and then straight down. Um, and then there's the end of that tube is 4 finger widths below the navel, inside the body, in front of the spine. That's the central channel because it's kind of medial to the body. And then you have the left and the right channels, which begin in the nostrils, inside the nostrils. The right channel is on the right side, the left channel is on the left side. Um, and these two, they just follow the central channel in terms of going up and then straight down. And then they also terminate on the left and right side of so their right channel is just straight right, left channel is just straight left, also terminating 4 finger widths below the navel, inside the body, directly in front of the spine. And then they say that the left and the right channels, they kind of curve inward and they kind of uh, go inside the central channel. They kind of at this terminal point, 4 finger widths below the navel, left and the right kind of just curve inward and flow into the central channel. So they begin, all 3 channels begin here, here, and here, and then they left and the right kind of taper and terminate into the central channel, um, at the lower level of the body. So, and and they say that the left and the right are just slightly smaller and thinner than the central channel. So, central channel is about the size of the pinky. The left and the right are just slightly smaller than that, so that they can kind of, and then at the terminal point, they become even a bit more tapered and a bit more kind of, as they curve inward, they become a bit more sort of tapered. Um, so we try to hold that visualization of these 3 channels, as we engage in the meditation. I think, and just thin, flexible, luminous tubes of light, um, in these 3 places. So as you're holding that visualization, what you do is you take your right hand and you take the index finger of your right hand and you physically close the left nostril. And then you inhale through the right nostril. And as you do that, you visualize, kind of the energy coming, you kind of visualize fresh, beneficial energy kind of coming in with the in breath and kind of filling the right central channel. And then that kind of flowing into the the right channel, and then kind of flowing into the central channel, um, and kind of at this point, kind of pooling at the point where these three channels are being held at the forefinger widths below. So that's the in breath, is closing the left, inhaling, visualizing this channel filling with fresh energy, maybe crystalline white light, that sort of thing. And then at the top of the in breath, you release the left nostril and you close the right nostril. So now you've kind of closed off the right central channel. And now you are exhaling. And now you're visualizing that. And you can also visualize that during the inhalation, you can visualize that this fresh energy is sort of displacing kind of stale, yucky, energy that's kind of being pushed down, and then it's kind of being held in that kind of nexus point. And then during the exhalation, you kind of think about ejecting that stale energy up through the left channel, and now it's being kind of just dispelled out of the body and just let go and released. So it's an inhalation through the right and then an exhalation through the left. And you're trying to hold that visualization. I kind of think of it almost um, like glass tubes in a way that are like filling almost like with a liquid, and then just sort of like it's just sort of a closed system where it's filling and then kind of releasing. Um, so inhalation, exhalation. And you do that 3 times with the left closed, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. So you do that 3 times. And you just do it slowly, naturally, while trying to hold the visualization. And so that's the first section of the 3 breaths. Then the second section is just the reverse of that. So now, instead of breathing in, so you're always breathing in through the right and exhaling through the left for the first 3 breaths. Now you're just doing the opposite. Now you're closing the right, and all of your inhalations are through the left, and all of your exhalations are through the right. And you're again visualizing purifying light and the exhalation of kind of stale energy. So that's the second set of 3 breaths. So we're now up to 6. So you do that 3 times. And then the third set of 3 is breathing in through, so not closing any nostril and just naturally breathing in through both the right and the left nostrils, but now visualizing that this fresh energy is filling both right and left and pooling during the inhalation, then coming down and pooling kind of at the bottom there from both directions. And then the exhalation, you visualize that it's coming up through the central channel now, and it's actually being, you're although you're breathing out through your nose, you're visualizing energetically that the negative energy or the stale energy is ejected through the third eye, through the opening of the central channel. Um, so it's kind of being like forcefully drawn up and then just shot out like that. And that's the third set of 3 breaths is like that. So that's what we'll do. We'll just silently um, do that. And we'll do 2 rounds of the 9 round. So you just breathe, try to breathe slowly, breathe naturally, breathe normally, and just try to hold that visualization as you go through. So I find that I have to kind of intentionally think about breathing more slowly because otherwise I've hyperventilated a little bit or gotten a little lightheaded. So I kind of have to I think about that particularly with that. Doesn't happen when I'm just doing a regular breathing meditation, but there's something about it where I, I kind of have to think about really going slowly. But um, so yeah, it's the kind of thing that you might do if I mean you could do it before every session of meditation if you wanted to. But when the mind is feeling particularly scattered or dull or kind of it's just sort of a clearing of the mind. It's kind of a way of just sort of resetting our sort of nervous system and our that sort of thing. Kind of balance. What they say is it sort of balances the energies.
Visuals are interesting. How do you visualize a smokestack? It's my equivalent of the exhale. It's probably different for everybody.
Okay, I think that was essentially everything to cover for today. Anything that would be helpful? Questions?
That was a 9 round?
Yeah, because there's 3 sets of 3. Three, three. Yeah. So that's one round. It's not one round has 9 breaths. Yeah. One breath meaning inhalation and exhalation. Yeah. So I would say generally do maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 at the most for a given. If you start doing like 5 or 6, then you do kind of get a little bit spacey. But so I would say, you know, no more than 3. I would say at a in a given. Any questions? Anything else that would be helpful? All right. So then we'll just dedicate. So again, we established a virtuous motivation at the beginning, and we listened and participated. And doing that, we actualized our intention, and that created positive energy in the mind. When that positive energy ripens, it will ripen in a beneficial way, being a positive karmic seed. So we just try to dedicate that positive karmic seed into ripening in the best way. So we try to visualize really expansive, beneficial ways of it ripening, ways that benefit countless sentient beings. We just try to very strongly think when that positive energy ripens, may it ripen in the best possible ways. And we try to visualize what that means to us. All right.